Literally, we revolve around the sun, but psychically and spiritually, the Earth is a center because she's a kind of heart. She's a very precious jewel in creation. Yeah. And what happens to her affects so many things. So the sun is broadcasting, and then the sun receives information, brings it back down, transmits that back down to Earth. So this conversation is going on. Some of these mountains have gone kind of quasi-dormant, and this is a bad moment for them to be dormant. And we could really use that input from cosmos right now. There's so much cosmos that wants to give us assistance. And actually, there's been a kind of like a sealing off, a barrier that has prevented a lot of this help from coming to Earth.
Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, this is arguably the conversation that I care about the most and possibly am the most excited about. Today, you will be hearing from an Indigenous teacher who was the most impactful guest teacher I had in seminary and has invaluable insights and wisdom to share with us. I hope this is the first of many conversations that Pat and I have on this podcast, but for now, I am grateful that she has chosen to join us at all. So, Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day, and accordingly, I wanted this episode to come out around this time for you to connect with the day and understand the people and culture that has been displaced by American colonialism, and the people and culture that we are responsible to, and the people and culture I believe we have the most to learn from. I want to honor the loss of so many lives, ancestral lines, languages, and deep cultural practices that have been lost as a result of colonialism. And I also want to acknowledge teachers like Pat McCabe and her daughter Lila June, who are trying to preserve the culture and teachings, help to heal the world of the disconnection that has also so long harmed and oppressed Indigenous people, cultures, and traditions. To lay the groundwork for this conversation, I want to share a couple of things. First of all, archaeological and genetic evidence show that Indigenous peoples have been here in North America for at least 23,000 years. Take that in for a second. And possibly as long as 30,000 years. I want you to be able to understand that contextually because it's a very, very long time. So based on the schooling that you likely had if you live in the U.S., you learned about America's history, probably starting with Columbus, who first arrived in the Americas in 1492. The first settlers then arrived in the U.S. in 1607, and the United States became independent of Britain in 1774. So, if we go off of when white settlers first arrived in Jamestown in 1607, Indigenous Americans have been stewards and residents of this land for between 55 and 72 times longer than white Americans and settlers of any race and culture have been on this land. 52 to 72 times longer. That is an immense amount of time, and I think we often don't take that context into account. In terms of population, the evidence is complicated, but it is estimated that across the Americas, there were about 112 million Indigenous Americans, and in the 1500s, 56 million of them were killed. That is half of the indigenous population. For reference again, because that is a huge number to wrap your head around, that is the entire current population of Kenya, or 6.5 times the population of New York City, if you need a little bit more of a local reference point. This has been called by far the worst human holocaust the world has ever witnessed, and yet it doesn't get that much attention. Bringing it more local, pre-1492, there were between 2 and 18 million indigenous peoples living in what we now call the United States, with around 7 million being the sort of general baseline thinking. But by 1800, only 600,000 indigenous people remained. And by 1900, the indigenous population in this country reached its lowest point of about 237,000 people. So it went from 7 million to 237,000 people. Today, there are now 5 million American Indians, Native Hawaiians, and Native Alaskans in the U.S., but the genocide and oppression of their people and their culture has caused indelible loss and trauma. I believe personally that it is essential to connect with, respect, and honor that Indigenous American people and culture have been horrifically oppressed and harmed by colonialism. There is so much repair and justice that is needed, but for now, it is important that we connect with and learn from people like our incredible guest here. So let me introduce you. Our guest today is Pat McCabe. Her Indigenous name is Weyakpa Najin Win. Woman stands shining. She is Diné, Navajo, and is a mother, a grandmother, activist, artist, writer, ceremonial leader, and international speaker. She is a voice for global peace, and her paintings are created as tools for individual, earth, and global healing. She draws upon the indigenous science of thriving life to reframe questions about sustainability and balance, and she is devoted to supporting the next generations, women's nation and men's nation, in being functional members of the hoop of life and upholding the honor of being human. She's showing us. I will send you a picture of this, everybody, but it's in the video. And if we include this, I will include that, but we will at least put a picture in the show notes. Her primary work at the moment is the reconciliation between the masculine and feminine, men's nation and women's nation, because we talk a lot about remembering, recreating, and creating a narrative for the sacred masculine, and addressing the archetypal wounding that occurred in our misunderstanding and abuse of technology in prayer, ceremony, and science. So fascinating. So Pat, I am so happy you're here. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. So what I'd like to do, if I may, is start out with a dedication, I'll say, and I'm bordering on a prayer here. Yes, I try to do this every time for every Zoom, every recording, every podcast to maximize, I guess, I don't know, maybe that's a little capitalist, but the potency and potential of our meeting here. So maybe just take a breath together. So Holy Mother Earth and all the life that's around us. So precious, so powerful, so much care and concern for our homes, our families, our water, for our own kind and those that meet us to give us our life. I reach out to you at this moment, and I ask that you might take a good look here. 2 or more are gathered, and we're talking about this Mother Earth. We're talking about the 5-fingered ones. We're talking about all my relations, all our relations. We're talking about humanity's presence here, and what do we know at this point in the creation story that began so long ago and that we're still telling right now? That's how I see this moment is what can we say, and what do we know, and what do we wonder about in terms of our presence on this Mother Earth? And I think part of this inquiry is also wondering, what is our contribution to life? What is our contribution to this incredible and perhaps improbable appearance of Mother Earth and this life and our own bodies, minds, hearts, and spirits? So I just ask for your input here. Holy Spirit, Holy One within each one of us who's listening, I call on you at this moment and ask that you speak. Let me be your hands and feet, your eyes, ears, and mouth, to say what is needed to say, and let this moment travel everywhere that it can serve, everywhere that it is needed, and everywhere that it can be of assistance, for the very highest possibility for life and light and love. So I'll start there.
Thank you so much. That is so beautiful. And it's interesting with this podcast, I'm often feeling like I want to, get as much out of the interactions as I can and learn as much as possible. But I sometimes find myself moving very fast, and it's lovely to drop in. So thank you for that. Thank you. It's really, really beautiful. So I want to ask this question of you, which is maybe not even the right question. And if it's not, then we will do another one, which is, what do you want people to know about Indigenous culture or the Indigenous experience or spiritual teachings? And it may be better, Pat, to literally just back up and say, like, how are you feeling about what's going on in the world in our country right now? I'm open to this shaping however it wants to shape. So
okay, well, you're kind of giving me carte blanche here, so
I am giving you carte blanche.
So one, I want to introduce myself a little bit further. I want to say that I come from Diné Nation, and so I'll say She'e'i. So I'm telling you about my clans, and we get our clans from our mothers. I think the ologists call us matriarchal. My daughter prefers the term matrifocal, which I like too. And yeah, so that's my bloodline. But I was also raised spiritually from the time I was about, 28, into the Lakota spiritual way of life. And that has given me so much. Not everything I say and do is exactly adhering to maybe what members of that nation would say is traditional teaching, but I always have to bring it up because it was such inspiration. And it's a vision and culture, meaning that we fast, no food and no water, usually for 4 days in different ways, in different contexts, and different parts of community, in order to connect with, as we brought up here, I'm showing this medicine wheel here, or the sacred hoop of life, I say. And so this is part of that practice of reaching out to what I call the larger community. So it's the larger community of life. And that's flying ones, swimming ones, creepy crawling ones, four-legged ones, standing nation, the tree people, the stone people, the waters, the skies, the stars. I mean, there's just so much. And part of our difficulty at the moment, I feel, is what, and I do like that term, is that we've become anthropocentric, I think is how you say that. Mm-hmm. Get a little fumbly on that word, but meaning that we center ourselves and we somehow believe that this whole creation is all about us. And so that's one of the primary differences, I think, between almost every Indigenous culture that I've encountered. And I travel all over the world to Indigenous peoples' gatherings, different ceremonies, different prayers. So I have a little bit of experience with so many other Indigenous peoples. But that's one of the primary differences I feel is in these cultures, there's an understanding that we are only a part of a tapestry of life, or sometimes I call it a symphony of life, versus everything is centered around us. And everything is here for us, and especially for our use and as our resource. That's the further we get away from understanding this construct of what this medicine wheel is describing, the more confused we get, and I'm going to say a little bit more out of line we get with the principles of Mother Earth and thriving life. Thriving life paradigm.
Yeah. I think the hoop of life is really beautiful. So why don't you describe it, Pat? I don't want to describe it.
So it's a circle, and there's different ones that are made, but this one is Lakota because of the colors that are used. And so it's a circle with kind of an equilateral cross going through it. There's black, red, yellow, white sections, equal sections. Also, each of the arms of the cross in the center is black, red, yellow, white. And if you look, it's also describing a kind of motion. The way that the center arm of the color then extends out to the outer side of the circle. So we could say it's moving. And that's also a key principle that was brought up to me, and I feel like I've come to learn myself via, again, the fasting, is that there's this idea of takuwa kanshkanshka, and that's talking about how it's the sacred movement in all things. So nothing is stationary, nothing is fixed, which is kind of ironic. Maybe I'll talk about that in terms of cultural interruption. There's an irony there. But anyway, just to talk about this sacred hoop. So these four directions represent, we sometimes say, the four colors of mankind: black, red, yellow, white. It can also represent or speak to the nature of four different periods of a human being's life, like the child coming into adolescence, or the ability to further life, kind of like your most active, mature part of your eldering. So it's acknowledging, and I've heard elders speak to it that way. And then we also say that there's certain spiritual help, and this sometimes can be like animals, or also maybe elements, or also known spirit helpers that have come to our aid as human beings here, that seem very concerned with what happens here on Earth, even from the non-material realm of dimension. And so there's different medicines that lie in each of the four directions. This is describing probably so much more. Recently, I was hearing from a Lakota person that this isn't really Lakota, which that comes up so much. But for me, it's really describing so much of what I've encountered, and actually what was shown to me in a vision at one point. So when I had this vision about the medicine wheel, I'm kind of holding it vertical so we can see it, but really it's kind of, we would see it like this.
Like flat. Okay.
Yeah, it's flat. I mean, it's flat, but it's vertical and horizontal.
Right.
And there's always that center point, right? But I saw this over Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, which is my people's territory. I saw it like this. What was described to me in that vision actually had to do with the four colors of mankind. And I literally woke up. I was trying to be a dutiful, righteous, spiritual woman, and my plan was to get up at dawn and pray. But I had such an emotional day the previous day. I won't go into that whole story yet, but that I ended up waking up in my tent, and the sun was up. It was way up, and I was in there like in a Ziploc baggie or something, I was like sweating and everything.
Yes.
I'm like, what am I doing? Still sleeping, but I could hear this sound. And so I got out of my tent, and I was camped on the edge of the canyon. And when I looked out over the canyon, what woke me up was there was literally a lot of emotion going right now. I have a little injury going too. So I'm
Pat has a broken wrist, very newly broken wrist, which I have a lot of empathy for.
I'm very raw right now.
Yes. Well, we welcome it all, Pat. Yeah.
But I saw what woke me up was literally this pair of eagles were circling over the canyon. And so they were right at my level, because I was standing at the edge of the canyon. And they were calling out to each other. And that's what actually woke me up. I haven't thought about it for a while. And so that's how I ended up seeing this hoop. And in that instance, what I saw was, I'm holding it up again flat. I saw that there were all the different races, peoples, nations of humanity. And one thing I want to say about that is, I say culture is not a human construct. Culture is the Mother Earth expressing herself as human being in any given place. Maybe I should say not only a human construct, but it is actually the Mother Earth expressing herself as human being in any given place. So to be indigenous means to be of place. And some people object to that word, and that's because it's sometimes linked with a derogatory or supremacist view. Those people over there, those indigenous people. So some indigenous people, however they want to be called, don't like it. But I think it's very accurate, because it's describing that we are of place. And so when you're of place, so for instance, I got so many things going on here. I wish you could see, but this is one of the little helpers I have here. It's a little nest of turquoise stones. So we wear turquoise. I'm not wearing a lot right now because I'm the doctor, but we wear turquoise as Diné people, and that's from our place. And we have developed a certain relationship over that very long period of time that you were referring to at the beginning here. So we're wearing this stone that is of place. And at the same time, this stone is providing us with guidance, direction, health, beauty, always. And also we have different, our Anyway, so wherever you see Indigenous peoples, right, one of the hallmarks of Indigenous peoples is they're always wearing all this wild stuff from the earth, right?
Yeah, no, it's amazing.
Feathers,
yeah,
or fabrics that are woven, or paints. And so this is because we are in mad love affair with our place. Sometimes, I mean, I don't know how elders would feel about this, but sometimes to kind of put it in context, I say, when you're like crazy, crushed out in love with somebody, and you have a chance to like wear your boyfriend's t-shirt, you're just like in heaven.
I love that.
You're like, yay, I can smell him. He wore this.
I love that.
It's like that, you're just, you're so in love with place, and and the place is feeding you and forming you. And also place gives us this continual encounters. So it's ever expanding. It's not fixed. So again, takawa shkan shkan shkan, sacred motion. So anyway, so what I saw was that all these different nations were on this sacred hoop. And what I saw and what the words that kind of came at the same time was, so look at this hoop and you can see that some of the places on the hoop are crumbling. Some of the places on the hoop are missing. And some of the areas of the hoop is still really strong and intact. But you can see what happens when different peoples are breaking down or are going missing. You can see the tenuousness of, we'll say, the integrity of the strength of the hoop, right?
So are you saying that the strength of the place loses its strength when the people are lost?
Oh, yes.
Yes. But also,
vice versa.
And vice versa. That's what I was thinking too, is like when the people are displaced, then they lose the sense of place. And so there's the disconnection from place is incredibly harmful to.
Well, yeah. And so, in fact, an Indigenous people, here's a generalization for you. Indigenous people cannot be who they are outside of their place. So this is a concept that is a little bit difficult to reconcile in modern world paradigm because we're like zooming all over the place, right? Like I've lived in Taos now for 37 years,
right.
Just barely on the edge of my people's territory. Some people say it's within it. Some people say it's just on the outside. But yeah. But I've lived here 37 years, and that's a long time for a human being to live in one place at this point, right? And I learn a lot from being here. Like I don't get to just, well, one, I'm in a small town too. So I have just use this as an example, a contemporary example. So I have a skill set that a lot of people don't have who are moving, say, every 3 or 4 years for work or whatever. And yet here, so if I have a falling out with somebody, I'm going to encounter them again. I don't get to just be anonymous and walk away. I'm going to encounter them again. And so we go through these cycles. Before I had kids, I encountered people. I might have had a falling out with them. Then I have kids. All of a sudden, we're like soccer momming together, and we're going to coordinate bringing cupcakes or whatever. So you kind of have to have a certain level of humility in relationship. You have to have a certain amount of openness. Gosh, I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago. Are you? So I can't just fixed in place, And we all want to see our children thrive. We want to see our community thrive. So we want to keep open. And I just think, wow, it must be really, it would contribute to a certain kind of pessimism to move every 2 or 3 or 4 years and never have those opportunities of reconciliation, reparation, allowing each other to grow and to become new. Like, what would you really think about other people? You'd just be like, just full of nutcases and jerks or something, and I got to get out of here,
Moving on. Yeah.
Man, when you're pinned to the ground in a small town over a long period of time, all kinds of stuff happens. And so now, my kids, they knew them when they were all wild. Now they know them as they're contributing members to community. They're hopeful watching my grandchildren. So, it's a really different thing. So imagine being in a society that has been there for 5,000 years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years. So this kind of relationship isn't only happening between other human beings, it's happening between mountains and trees. I mean, I know down in Chile, the Mapuche have this relationship with these, what they call a monkey something. Anyway, they're a kind of pine tree, and they have these huge piñon nuts in them, which we share that in common. When we were being hunted down by the Spanish here in this part of the world, our piñon nuts saved our lives. So we have We have such, we subsisted on pinon at times. And so in Chile, same thing. Their pinons are much bigger, but they have that. But anyway, so these trees over a period of time, another name for them is that they're walking trees. Because as the climate changes go on, the trees move up the hills into the mountain, and then they come back down. And so the people over time get to have a relationship like that with these trees.
Wow.
So imagine all the different possibilities of living in place and learning and being able to contribute to the well-being of your surroundings over that kind of period of time.
Right.
And I'll add the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot, especially recently, is we human beings have the honor. So there is conversation going on between Earth and cosmos at all times. So we see models of the solar system. And, I love the one that kind of shows it in 3D, and you get to see all these patterns of the planets moving around.
Yeah.
But you notice it's also traveling through space. So there could be different frequencies, different dimensional aspects of our whole galaxy moving through what we call space. And so there's different influences that we have that I think our Mother Earth participates in, and she has her own goals within that. She has her own contributions to make and her own mission, so to speak. And so one thing that also is sort of missing out of modern world culture is this idea that we can participate as human beings in the conversation taking place between Earth and cosmos. So we can
participate.
We get to participate. We can participate. We're not passive in that.
Interesting. How are we participating? Or how can we? Yeah.
Yeah. So in the ceremonies, there's an acknowledgement. I mean, we of course, my elders in both the cultures that sort of I was brought into, my own bloodline culture, Diné, and then Lakota, they talk about how we came from the stars. We traveled the Milky Way to come here. And so there is, it's so interesting to me because it's taken a lot of years for me to realize, like when we start talking about extraterrestrials and aliens, I'm like, no, thank you. I don't want to talk about it. But when my elders start talking about how we traveled the Milky Way to come here, I'm like, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Obviously.
So, kind of took a while to realize we're talking about a similar thing, probably the same thing in different ways here. So I've become a little more receptive to the whole ET and alien conversation, but it's pretty far out there a lot of the time.
Yes, it is.
Although I have been told, spiritually, like you've gone as far as you can without acknowledging, and I'm so happy that you did at the beginning of this conversation. That almost never happens. But, you've gone as far as you can. This is my guides talking to me, without really considering the very long human history on the planet, much longer than anybody. And they're talking hundreds of thousands of years. Okay?
Right.
And your relationship to the star beings. So, because I was just like, I don't want to talk about star beings. And Spirit's like, that's fine. That's fine. But just know you've gone as far as you can go without including that part. And so it's so tricky. Always knows just what to say to get me going. I'm like, all right. What about the star being? So we're kind of in the whole inquiry about that now. And
interesting. Anyway. Yeah, I mean, interesting. That's an interesting. It feels very different, Pat. I mean, we need to do a different episode on this altogether, but it feels different.
Yeah, there's a whole thing.
Yeah. So I think the thing that you said that to me, I want to highlight the most, besides all of it, because it's all super important and really fascinating, is this concept that is so powerful and that I resonate with so deeply, that is true in all Indigenous teachings and cultures, which is that we are a part of everything. It's not about us using the resources of the earth. It's not like we are not better than or more than or anything like that. And so for us to be looking at the earth as a resource, to me, is incredibly harmful. And I too see us as connected to everything. Everything is connected. We are connected to one another. We are connected to source. We are connected to the earth. We're connected to all the beings. Everything is like this mycelium network of interconnection in this incredible web that's woven between all of us. And so within that context, Pat, what is going on in the world right now? Like, what is happening? It just feels, I mean, to me, you were mentioning, like, as people get farther and farther away from that truth, and that to me is like the farther you get away from that, the more disconnected you are. And often the more sort of like ego-driven you are, self-driven, but not like the capital S self that is the self that's connected and aligned with creation and all that is and divine mystery, but like self that is completely disconnected from that. And so I'm personally seeing this like huge swing of ego self, individualized self, fear and power struggle and trying to take control and stay in control. And then there's this other stuff going on where people are trying to be more connected. But I'm curious from your perspective, like, what are you seeing? What is going on right now? It's crazy. It is wild.
Yeah. So I think at a certain point, we depart from super harmful to actually psychopathic.
Yes, agreed. Yeah.
Moment. I'm going to continue with this just a little bit because I think it's going to help. It's going to help with the foundation. So I'll just finish up the part about, okay, so human beings can participate in this conversation between Earth and cosmos. And I just recently was called on to take on stewardship of land at the base of one of our 4 sacred mountains. So the mountain has this broad base and then comes up to this peak, right? So what was said to me was, so the mountain is actually gathering all of this Earth energy and then it's focusing it. And it's like, how many times that's never occurred to me, you know?
Yeah, me neither.
Right. And so mountains are a big part of the conversation between Earth and cosmos. So it's actually focusing news of Earth, I'll say, and probably lots of other things, but news of Earth and sending it, focusing it. And I'm going to say perhaps it is sending that to our holy star, the sun. And then the sun is actually broadcasting out to the cosmos. And there's much in the cosmos that is very concerned with Earth. Some of my elders say Earth is the heart of it all. So, Copernicus maybe didn't have it entirely. Literally, we revolve around the sun, but psychically and spiritually, the Earth is a center because she's a kind of heart. She's a very precious jewel in creation. Yeah. And what happens to her affects so many things. So anyway, the sun is broadcasting, and then the sun receives information, brings it back down, transmits that back down to Earth, and then anyway, this conversation is going on.
Yeah, interesting.
So at this mountain where I've been called on to steward, what the mountain is saying is human beings, here I go, I'm going to cry again. Some of these mountains have gone kind of quasi-dormant, and this is a bad moment for them to be dormant. Because we could really use that input from cosmos right now. There's so much cosmos that wants to give us assistance. And actually, there's been a kind of like a sealing off, a barrier that has prevented a lot of this help from coming to Earth. But recently, I don't know how, when we say recent in Earth, but I think it's more like in the last 50 years, maybe.
Okay.
Is my sense. That barrier is being pierced. It's not solid anymore. So there are things coming through that are helping us. So if we think wild and crazy right now, my sense is it would be much worse if that weren't happening.
Okay.
Because that which has been trying to hold this barrier and keep all this contained for its own purposes, so I want to get to that, but that's being interrupted. So the mountain is actually saying to me, so yeah, if you have ceremonies that you've carried for thousands of years in relation to this mountain, by all means, enact them. But if you don't come from a people who have that, you can still participate. Because you know how we feel when we approach a mountain, we get exhilaration. We get, as I'm driving up to this mountain, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
Bigger, right?
Yeah.
And so, and so as you approach it, you have that sense of grandeur. So you have this awe, you have exhilaration, you have this appreciation. And then when you actually start hiking on them, and many peoples aren't interested in getting on top. They don't feel like that's a place for human beings. but we can approach onto them to some degree. And so what the mountain has said to me is, even if you will consciously, one, acknowledge that you have a capacity to participate in that huge conversation going on between Earth via the mountains to the cosmos, one, you have to begin to remember that you have that capacity. Two, intentionally direct all of that emotion, all of that feeling, and say, I contribute this to this conversation that's taking place between Earth and cosmos. I dedicate it, if you will. I offer it.
What are you offering?
You're offering all that emotion, that exhilaration.
The emotion. Got it.
Yeah. And so that, they're saying, if human beings could begin to remember and believe that we have that capacity, even if you don't have all the old ceremonies. And if you look at Indigenous peoples all over the world, they usually have big ceremonies associated with different mountains close by. But even if you don't have that, just your own emotion from your heart, directed consciously, can be a contributing factor to this. And so I'm being asked to call people, and that'll be part of another campaign at another point. We can talk then.
We can definitely talk then.
They're like, it would be a really good thing for everything and everybody on Earth and all the life if this mountain were not semi-dormant. So now would be a great time for people to begin to focus. So I would say that doesn't even mean you have to literally be in the presence of it. You can meditate on such a thing. So for instance, this is part of cooperation and collaboration. I mean, my grandmother say, if we could only understand that there is much in the cosmos that depends upon the human heart, which is something that we have been taught is trivial, it gets in the way, it impairs progress. It must be included from the Western scientific method. So we've been talked out of one of our most powerful aspects and contributions to Earth, life, creation, cosmos.
Our emotions. You're saying our emotions.
Our heart, our feeling, yeah.
And let me just, I feel like I'm feeling compelled to ask this question, Pat. When you're explaining that process, which is so beautiful, of giving your contribution to the mountains, to the cosmos, to this flow of energy and life force sort of in and out of the earth and mountains, it sounds like you're saying to contribute this sense of awe and this sense of gratitude and exhilaration and all of the things. I'm curious, what about like the heartbreak and the heartache and the pain and the suffering? Like, will we harm mountains or cosmos or anything if we bring the not quote unquote positive emotions to the mountains or to nature?
So I don't think I've received from my guides information about that, but my sense is, so when I talk about offering that awe, that exhilaration in response to the majesty of mountains, for myself, I would be praying. So I'm going to put it in context. I know not everybody is comfortable with prayer, but but I'll just say it that way. So when you're going to pray, man, you got to pray the truth. There's no sense. There's no sense posting in prayer. You got to pray the truth. And so I think to try to offer it all, try to remember to offer that interruption of our sorrow that mountains will bring, but then to tell the truth. We've been placed in paradise and look what's happening. Yes, I contribute my heart and my exhilaration, but also my confusion and sorrow. Yes, please come and help. Yes, please come and help now. Yes, I say yes.
Got it. Yeah. So it's about connecting and giving ourselves, right? Giving of ourselves and being in connection with that flow of energy, being a part of it.
That's right. I think just offering up our authentic heart. Yeah. But offering our heart. So I'm going to go back to this medicine hoop one more time. So I had that vision and I saw all the different peoples. Well, from that time, what's also happened with this sacred hoop vision and understanding, the teaching, it gives me a way to hold on to a whole bunch of stuff that's going on all the time. I also saw that every single life form has been given a seat on this sacred hoop. Not just human beings.
Right.
it's a way of looking at us, but there's another way too. There's another layer here. So human beings get to have a seat, one small part of the hoop, a seat, but then all the rest of the life also gets to have a seat. And so what the words that have come to talk about that is to say that every entity, every member, if you will, of the sacred hoop of life has its contribution to make to the whole. And so I say every being, every member has been given a perfect design for thriving life. And that includes us. The fact that we have been given the honor of having a seat on that sacred hoop means that we also have a perfect design for thriving life. The big question is, do we understand what that is, right? But so when we look at that structure that way, what I say then is, so therefore, if anybody isn't making their contribution for a perfect design for thriving life, then the integrity of the hoop begins to fail. So we're witnessing this now. Why are we witnessing this? Because one, we're starting to lose species. So, like for instance, I worked for a river organization here in northern New Mexico called Amigos Bravos. And, people, we were talking about how the silvery minnow was disappearing. And people say, who cares if the freaking silvery minnow is leaving us? It's just a little fish, Yeah. So biologists say, well, it's an indicator that something is going wrong with the whole ecosystem. So there again, spiritually, we're saying, look, if the silvery minnow goes, if the last, white rhinos or is it black? Anyway, if all the different species are leaving, this is a problem for the integrity of the hoop.
Right.
And it's also a problem if any member of the sacred hoop is prevented from making their contribution. So then we start bumping into the spiritual laws of our construct of earth, So anytime one person's free will or one being's free will overtakes the free will of another, that's a violation of, we could say spiritual law, but it's really, we can just put it in terms of the way it works.
Yeah.
That's how it works. And we don't get to change that with our opinion, is the thing. This is how Earth works, and that's a pretty bold statement for this girl to be making, but as far as I can tell, that's what's being shown to me. Like, our opinion does not change the truth of the construct of Earth. And so at that point, we're entering into this realm of maybe what some people have heard that is connected to Indigenous peoples is original instructions, right? Original instructions are talking about, hey, maybe it'd be good for you all to understand the setup that you're in. Because if you can understand that, then you can make choices about how to move accordingly.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm getting to what do I see happening on Earth, but it helps for what I would say about it to know this context. So one thing that I say, every single other member on the sacred hoop, let's just take buffalo, for instance. So buffalo isn't only, has an understanding of how to make its own kind thrive. It's always moving towards more life. It's always naturally moving towards furthering the next 7 generations. It doesn't even have to think about it. And I actually wonder, because people say, well, the difference between human beings and animals is we have consciousness and this. I'm like, maybe these guys have had consciousness and been plugged into the reality of how Earth works for so long that they don't have to get confused and work it all out and go into deep philosophies about it. It's just like, it's about life. Hello. It's about life. Yeah. I got it. Got it.
Yeah.
So that's what they do, right? So the reintroduction of buffalo, which was also a big part of the genocide, well, it was buffalo genocide, but also because of our relationship, Indigenous peoples, human beings' relationship with this powerful being. So as buffalo is being reintroduced, we're seeing ecosystems be repaired. Just like when we see wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone, they couldn't believe how the entire landscape changed, right? So every being has its way of furthering its own kind, but also contributing to all the life in its vicinity.
Right.
And so you could say that this buffalo, because it's enacting its perfect design for thriving life, is actually a benefit and blessing to the entire hoop.
Right. That makes sense.
I say it understands Omni-Benificence. This is my new obsessive word that I coined.
Omni-Benificence. Okay.
Omni-Benificent. So this buffalo is omni-beneficent. It is a blessing and benefit to all.
Mm.
And we can say every single other member of the sacred hoop of life has got this down and has figured it out. Their presence furthers life by being. And so I say this, to me, I believe, is the human being's task, is to understand how do we move into omni-beneficence, like all of the rest of the members of the sacred hoop. Well, one of our biggest obstacles is we have been led to believe that somehow I can be well if you are not well.
Right.
And the truth is that, and I love Thich Nhat Hanh for giving us an English word for this. He speaks to us and he says, we are interbeing. And that's a very profound level of interrelatedness, interconnectedness, interdependence. We can say that even though we have eagles and bears and platypus and algae and palm trees, and they all look like different things, which they are, it's really all of them together, which is what this symbol is pointing to, that makes up a single organism called Earth. So if you're a single organism and your liver is fighting with your, pancreas or whatever, you got a problem. If the liver, that it can steal from all the other organs and only make itself stronger and better, what happens to the whole organism? Right. So this is a way to look at it. So right now, I feel like our kind is getting schooled. I don't want to say it hasn't happened yet. First world nations still aren't feeling it hugely, but we're starting to.
Yeah.
The weather stuff is like, it's indiscriminate. It's nothing personal, but it's indiscriminate. And it's taken things out. But we're starting to understand the consequence of not aligning with the construct of Earth. So I woke up and this phrase came to me, and it was, Mother Earth has only one rule: life. That's her rule. So you can either get on board with how life happens here, which means you're going to have to get on board with the idea that every single action, and this actually goes into consciousness too, not just outward action, because I think every physical manifestation actually begins in belief and consciousness and with all the rest of the parts that we've been talked out of. But every single action affects every other life form every single time. Yes. So if we could grok that and begin to be responsible and accountable for that, many things would change. So you ask, what do I see going on? I see us having to face the consequences of being out of alignment with Earth construct, out of alignment with what this symbol is trying to show us and teach us about how it works. Yeah. Maybe I'll stop there for a second.
Yeah. No, I appreciate all of that understanding. And it is a really helpful visual to have this hoop of life, that one thing gets thrown off, then the hoop is not continuing. Because you mentioned earlier, Pat, the idea of like barriers. I think you said it's the word that I use, like barriers to connection. But one person is preventing someone else from being aligned and on their life's path, that creates incredible harm. Both as species are being harmed and endangered and then disappearing and going extinct, but also individuals, right? Like it happens within our species also. It's many levels deep, clearly. So, yeah. So I really appreciate that visual and understanding it. So when you look at what's going on specifically with this election, is there anything that you want to share about what you're seeing within our country and our society as a people?
Well, I do, but I want to back up to the way you opened here. Yeah. With the extermination of Indigenous peoples. Yeah. So this, it's not nice. Genocide is just not nice.
No, it's definitely
really, really not nice.
Really terrible. Yeah.
But there's a bigger issue here than the fact that it's not nice. And that is that, and this part I still don't totally understand why or how this happened, but there are certain groups of human beings who have been trying to understand how to move into omni-beneficence, who have been trying to live in societies, in communities that acknowledge interbeing, that acknowledge all our relations.
Mm-hmm.
And we call these people indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm.
So they have furthered a science of being a human presence of omni-beneficence, more than any that we are aware of.
Yes.
And they are still here. It's kind of surprising to me when people are shocked that I'm actually still a Native person and I exist. Who is talking to you? But yeah.
That's terrible. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if that's your education, what are you going to do? So,
yes. Yeah.
But anyway, so to exterminate this library of human understanding of how to be an omni-beneficent, or moving towards it anyway, omni-beneficent human presence on the planet, that's bad for everybody. It would be really helpful not to have to reinvent the wheel, okay? And so I just want to pause for that moment and say, you know, the encroachment on indigenous communities by extraction is not only not nice and unjust, but it's actually doing such harm for the possibilities of being able to still access this science of right relations, this science of understanding, of aligning with the way life works on Mother Earth. So the extermination of our languages is, we can't even say everything that it is, because those languages were given to us in this process of learning some of the deepest symbiosis between human being and Earth. And again, we can't be the peoples that we are outside of our place. We can't just pick up and be moved over here and continue. I mean, we can to some degree, but we lose so much by not being able to continue to have this presence in place. And furthermore, I, as an Indigenous Diné woman, my daughter, Lila June, had the second womanhood ceremony in my family in 4 generations because of the cultural interruption of the residential boarding schools, in which the project was to make our own culture so horrible to us that we would never return to it.
Right.
And there was some success in this campaign.
Yes.
You know, so my grandparents were sent to residential boarding school. They eventually sent their own kids because the Great Depression hit at the same time. Our way of life was dismantled and their choices were very limited. But, you know, so by the time I came along, nobody was speaking my language. Nobody was praying the way that I do. Nobody was thinking of the kinds of things, at least they weren't expressing it to me. Because it was made repulsive to us. So I guess what I want to say about that is that when my daughter had her ceremony, what I saw was the honoring of her becoming a life bringer, life bearer. And that might be a human child, but it could be many other things. It could be bringing vision, bringing new ceremony, bringing songs, bringing new ways to continue to deepen this relationship between Earth and cosmos and place. But it was also the furthering and the keeping of our pact with life, to say this young woman can provide future generations of our kind as human beings, in this case, Diné, who have been informed by place, and can be a part of the conversation of the furthering of life. So to interrupt Indigenous people's pact at that level also is irresponsible and speaking doom to the future.
Right.
And I guess the last thing I'll say on this piece is they say at this point, and I'm actually deeply involved in a campaign of calling on different groups. Right now we're working actually with Catholic sisters to say, I will be complicit no more with the doctrine of discovery, because That was ill-gotten premise that we're using it as legal precedent. Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2006 cited the doctrine of discovery to not have to bring to bear treaty rights for Indigenous peoples in what we now call the state of New York. 2006, the doctrine of discovery is still being invoked as a legal basis. That's crazy. I mean, part of the Papal Bulls, that was the one that said, just for those who aren't unclear, this was sent out with the explorers, right? So if you encounter lands that don't have any human beings of the one true faith, we will say that they don't have souls. And if you don't have a soul, you can't own land. Here's this totally convoluted logic, right? And so you may take that land as empty, terra nullius, and you may also take these soulless animals, I think they called us humanus animalis or something, you may take them into perpetual slavery. This is what is being cited as legal basis, right? So yeah, we're calling on different factions to say, and to figure out how to enact. How can I really enact being complicit no more with a bogus legal bearing that has played out in ways? But what the point I'm trying to get to is because of the doctrine of discovery and the Papal Bulls that outlined this, that extermination that you talked about at the very beginning took place with righteous vengeance, power, misplaced, ill-gotten, unjustified power. But they say that alone began to change the climate of the earth.
Yes. Yeah. I've read that. Yeah. It's fascinating. And not surprising, especially because of the way that Indigenous teachings and culture are intertwined with the land. I mean, to then become power over the land and power over the climate and power over the earth as opposed to power with and interbeing with will have massive impact. Clearly, I mean, we have changed the climate. So yeah, that's real.
Yeah, I'm really trying to bring up my sister's name. Maybe there's an opportunity for me to send it to you. So I'm working with all these very brilliant Indigenous attorneys and people working in this field and who can really articulate deeply what the impact of the doctrine of discovery has been, not only on Indigenous people, but on life on the planet.
Yeah, send it to me because we will include it in the show notes so people can look into it more. So everybody can find it in the show notes or on the webpage. So yeah, thank you, Pat.
So I don't have much to say about the election except for this. So I'll just throw this in at the tail end here. It's a dilemma for me, as it is probably for everybody at this moment. But I'll tell you why it's such a big dilemma for me. So spiritually speaking, the construct of this Mother Earth is it's a free will construct. And so what that says is, again, anytime one person's free will, so one, we've been talked out of the fact that that's a gigantic inherent spiritual gift or power that each one of us is given. Our will, but also our consent. So anytime somebody runs over another person's free will and consent, there's an accounting that must come due. This is my understanding of the spiritual law. And so what we do with our consent is really, really important. And we have been completely talked out of the power of our consent from birth. Our mama signs us away to be, here in this country, to be collateral as taxpayer. You know, we get assigned from birth our little number, right? So we're going to be collateral for the U.S. government for the rest of our lives without our consent. And so we immediately get plugged into that. So our consent is not considered there. We are often given questionable shots and such without our consent. That changes our biology right from the get-go. We're plugged into school systems that are teaching intentionally or unintentionally, and sometimes I think it is intentional, misinformation or outdated information that's really meant to indoctrinate us into power over paradigm, which is a paradigm that is antithetical to the thriving life paradigm. And that's also, we don't, it's not explained to us. We don't have consent.
Right.
This goes on and on. So we've been completely talked out of the true spiritual power of our consent. So I've been on a campaign also to say to other human beings, consider your consent, and it is important to declare. So we often say, well, it doesn't matter what I want. They're just going to do it anyway. They're just going to do it anyway. So what does it matter?
That's what a lot of people are saying about this election, too.
So I say declaring your consent is very, very important because it brings spiritual law and accounting into play. If we don't declare our consent or dissent, I do not consent to, we don't engage spiritual law. We consent by default. So the election is a tough place to bring up this subject because, anyway, well, that's a whole other subject. But for me, I don't want to give consent in either direction because I'm realizing that to cast my vote for an individual means I give my consent to them carte blanche with whatever they want to do to it. I'm just handing over one of the most powerful spiritual aspects that I've been given. And I'm saying, here you go. You can have it. You do whatever you want with it. And
you're giving them your proxy. Like you're interesting. Okay. Got it. Yeah.
That's a big dilemma for me right now. So I go back and forth, but I think I probably will vote. But I am actually, I don't know, I'm going to write it out. I'm going to lay down tobacco over it. I'm going to make sure that I'm saying I am taking this action because if I don't, I fear what might happen. However, but I'm going to have some caveats about giving my consent here. And that's the best I know how to do in this situation. So
that's interesting. I mean, because it is the president of the United States has a lot of power, right? And does appoint cabinet members and Supreme Court justices and different things. So it is a lot of power that you're putting into the hands of one person. Obviously, so much is also dictated by who's in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so giving consent with multiple candidates and like who you have representing you as a person is many layered and complicated, but you are giving quite a bit of consent to the person that you're voting for the president. So that is very interesting. And in that perspective, yeah.
Well, I mean, this probably goes without saying, but I don't really see very, very few, if any, political candidates that are fulfilling and acting on the will of the people at this point. So I think that was the idea, that you could have someone worthy of the trust of giving your carte blanche consent to, because they were constantly going to be listening to you, people, what your needs and what your wishes were. But that is not the case. So
it's a really broken system.
It's a little bit of a blight in the spiritual construct of Earth, in my view.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very broken system. And I know for me, I do feel that there is less harm that would be done with my consent by Kamala Harris than Trump. That's my impression of the situation. But that will make me really look at this differently, that you are giving your consent over to someone. Yeah, it's a big deal. So thank you for bringing that into the picture, Pat. Is there anything else that you would like to share with listeners today? Because I hope you'll be back and we have lots to talk about in general, but is there anything else that you would like to share today?
I'll just tell you one other thing that's been on my mind, and it's incomplete. So that's my caveat to say it out loud. but I've been thinking, so I don't think that the Mother Earth cares all that much about human justice. So again, if we go back to the image of the sacred hoop, so if human beings get to have a seat on part of the hoop, they're not the whole hoop.
Right.
We get to have, so I say we are accountable for our kind, just like all the elephants are accountable for their kind, all the algae is accountable for its kind, et cetera. So we're accountable for the sum total of our presence and what kind of impact it has. I just don't feel like the Mother Earth is saying, well, I'll support those people who, are doing ceremony and this, I'll support, but those Swiss people, man, they're just all screwed up. No, I don't see her, I mean, sorry, picking on the Swiss, but, I just don't see her dividing us up into these factions that way. And so, our squabbles, and they're pretty serious at the moment, no doubt.
They are.
They have definitely hit psychotic stage. And I say in the power over paradigm, which is not what this is speaking to, in the superimposed human construct upon Mother Earth thriving life paradigm. And it hasn't been around that long, version anyway. But I say, so in the power over paradigm, you must have power over another in order to get what you need.
Right.
And which is antithetical to Mother Earth economy. I say her economy is radical abundance and fearless generosity.
Say it again. Radical abundance and fearless generosity.
That's it. That's her. So if you have a fruit tree, which I have a bunch, you know this is true. Like you can't even deal with one fruit tree's fruit. Okay. And I got 30. I'm like, what were you thinking planting 30? but so it's throwing down hundreds of apples. Every apple could make 6 more trees if it felt like it. Like that to me, that's the example of her economy.
Yeah.
So to have power over paradigm be the dominant influence of our kind on the planet is problematic for the rest of the hoop.
Yeah.
But I'm not quite sure then what kind of justice can I participate in at this point? Because I just don't think she's all wrapped up in even, in some ways, even justice for Indigenous peoples. Although if we were to consider, I just think it's about reframing the conversation. I'm not sure what that reframing will bring. But this is coming up in this land back rematriation movement where land is being returned to Indigenous stewardship.
Right.
That can be a great thing. If land were returned to my tribal government, however, we're probably one of the largest extracting Indigenous nations on the planet at the moment. We're the second richest Indigenous people in the U.S., and that has everything to do with extraction. So I'm not so crazy about the idea of land being returned to my tribal government. Now, this taking on the stewardship of the land at the base of one of our 4 sacred mountains, I'm kind of just keeping them out of it. I'm like, no, thank you. But so in other words, it's complex. So
very complex.
Justice. Where does justice lie? What kind of justice should I be concerned with? What kind of trouble does seeking justice get us into, especially at this moment when the earth is like, look, friends, I got one rule around here and it's life, and you're not playing by the rules.
Right.
And I have got nothing against you. It's just that you can't make it here if you can't understand how life works here.
Right. And so it's like, where do you put your time and energy to try to bring balance back into the wheel, to bring, connection and interconnectedness back together and interbeingness, as opposed to, is justice a part of that conversation, or do we focus our time and energy somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a hard question.
That is a big one, Pat.
It's really coming up for me. So to be continued.
To be continued.
I feel like the Spirit is leading me there. It keeps kind of rising. Because the Mother Earth justice is different from our justice.
That's very true. That's it. Yeah, that is a really powerful thing. What a place to end. Mother Earth justice is different than human justice. And perhaps Mother Earth's justice is where we are meant to be focusing, and potentially our salvation, if there is any. So thank you so much, Pat. Woman Stands Shining. I am so grateful to you being here. I hope this is the first of many conversations. And everybody, I will share some resources for you in the show notes and on the webpage. And thank you for being here, listening with us. It is such an honor, Pat. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. See y'all next time. Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Connected Way. You can find all the resources mentioned in the show and even more resources in the show notes and on the podcast page at theconnectedway.com/podcast. Before you go, a note about sponsorship. This podcast is currently sponsored by me, Rev Dev, and you, the listeners. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and the work of The Connected Way, enhancing individual and collective connection to self, others, the land, and spirituality, you can donate on the podcast webpage. There is never any pressure or expectation, but if you feel called to support the work, any contribution of any amount helps, as do your good thoughts. And finally, I'd love to hear your biggest takeaway from today's show. What inspired you? What surprised you or made you think? Let me know by posting a comment on any of the posts or DMing me on Instagram, or of course, you can always send me a message on the website. Thanks again for being here, friends. May this podcast bring more connection to you and the collective. And so it is. See you next time.